Hi, this is Liz DeVries with the Bozeman Public Library. Welcome to this presentation on Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, one of the characters in this year's One Book, One Bozeman novel. Elizabeth Gurley Flynn was born on August 7, 1890. Her mother was a seamstress and her father a civil engineer. Both were socialists. She learned their politics and she became a member of the Industrial Workers of the World Union, the IWW. The union was founded in 1905 and she joined in 1906 when she was 16 years old. Union members were called Wobblies. Gurley Flynn quickly became one of its most influential orators. She led several free speech battles and worker strikes across the country. She developed some of the strategies that the Wobblies used in free speech battles until the 1930s. She gave her first speech to the Harlem Social Club, titled What Socialism Will Do for Women. She and her father were arrested in 1906 for blocking traffic and disturbing the peace in New York City. The charges against her were later dropped. She was expelled from high school for her politics, but the IWW quickly recognized her skills as a jawsmith and put her to work recruiting new members and traveling the country on speaking tours, which led her to Montana. In the summer of 1909, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn arranged to go on a speaking tour around the Northwest states. Her husband, John Archibald Jones, also known as Jack, was on union business in Missoula, Montana. She was in Butte in June 1909, speaking at a gathering after the Miners' Day Parade. 30,000 people attended the parade. She continued to speak at gatherings in Butte for the next week, focusing on the Miners' Union and the Butte Workingmen's Union. She joined a lumber strike in Kalispell, then arrived in Spokane, where she stayed for the rest of the summer. Sometime in the fall, she arrived in Missoula. The free speech battle that took place in October of 1909 set the stage for later battles in Washington and California and solidified IWW tactics in those battles. Gurley Flynn led and devised some of the tactics used to win this particular battle for the labor rights activists. Missoula in the first decade of the 20th century was a transit hub for the Northern Pacific Railroad and a center for copper mining and lumber work. The Anaconda Copper Mining Company, known in the area simply as the Company, was also the largest company engaged in lumber work around Missoula. The miners were organized into the Western Federation of Miners, which was a very large and powerful union. The lumberjacks had no such union and were exploited by employment agencies and the company. Unlike mining, lumber work was seasonal, unskilled, and isolated. Workers often worked in logging camps away from communities and supporters and in horrible conditions. The work was dangerous and difficult, and the workers were underpaid. Lumberjacks often worked 12 to 14-hour days, slept on straw beds filled with pests, and fed rotting food. They were also exploited by job sharks. Employment agencies would pair workers with a company and transport them to the lumber camp for a fee or an advance on their wages. The company would then fire or lay them off after a few days or weeks. The employment agencies would keep the workers' wages while the company got the labor. The IWW responded to the situation in 1908 by sending Jack Jones to try and organize the lumberjacks. In September of 1909, Gurley Flynn, Jack Jones, and Frank Little began holding speeches and rallies at Missoula. The IWW leaders set up their headquarters in the basement of the Harnoy Theater. Across the street from them is Union Hall, the local chapter of the American Federation of Labor. Their daily spot for speaking was in front of the Florence Hotel, across from the Missoula Mercantile. They were at the corner of Higgins Avenue and Front Street, and their speeches could be heard by the local shopkeepers in 3 different employment agencies. They weren't the only group in the streets of Missoula, though. The local chapter of the Salvation Army was also parading the streets, singing, shouting, and playing instruments to preach about moral and spiritual redemption. Missoula had a city ordinance that made public speaking illegal on the streets, but the rule wasn't enforced until things reached a breaking point. On September 27, 1909, things in Missoula changed. That day, Gurley Flynn rallied at the corner of Front Street and Higgins Avenue in their usual spot. She was competing for attention with the Salvation Army and the daily bustle in the streets. Several soldiers visiting the city claimed they were attacked in an anarchist manner by a woman orator. In a later trial, the wobbly speakers were accused of insulting and heckling passers-by, who didn't stop to listen or participate in their rallies. The soldiers demanded they quit their speaking and leave town. They threatened to pull them down and send them on their way. The union reps refused to stop speaking. At this point, the local police and officials decided it was time to step in and stop the speeches for the protection of the speakers. On Monday, September 28, 1909, the police arrested Frank Little and Jack Jones, charging them with disturbing the peace. Gurley Flynn wouldn't be cowed into silence and began organizing more speakers, recruiting volunteers, and setting up additional protests. She herself didn't speak again for a few more days. Their trial was set for Thursday, September 30th. On the 29th, a young man stepped up to the wobbly soapbox and began reading the Declaration of Independence. An officer pulled him off and arrested him. Herman Tucker was an employee at the U.S. Forestry Department at the time. His office was just above the street on the second floor. He heard the beginning of the Declaration of Independence from the open window of his office, and when the speaker was cut off, he ran down the stairs, jumped on the soapbox, and continued where the previous man left off. He only got a sentence or two before he was pulled off the platform and arrested as well. The Wobblies would continue this tactic in the coming days. Speakers would start a speech, a labor song, or reading from the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution, but they would be interrupted and arrested, and another would take their place. The trial for the first four took place on the afternoon of the 30th. They were accused of insulting innocent bystanders, with the soldiers and Salvation Army participants enduring the largest number of insults. They were charged for violating City Ordinance No. 96, which is disturbing the peace. In defense, the Wobblies argued that the Salvation Army made more noise than they did. The judge ruled against the Wobblies. Each man was sentenced to 15 days in jail and a $10 fine. The judge offered them a suspension of the sentence if they promised not to engage in any more public speeches. All four men refused the bargain, and they all went to jail. Meanwhile, Gurley Flynn sent a telegram to the IWW headquarters in Spokane asking for assistance. The IWW posted in their newsletter, The Industrial Workers, "We invite every free-born American and every man who hates tyrannical oppression of the police to go to Missoula." On October 1st, the police released the four men they arrested the night before. On the evening of the 1st, these same men were arrested again for public speaking. They arranged a trial for the following day. Their arrest drew a large crowd that followed them down to the jail. This crowd didn't immediately dissipate, so the mayor ordered the police chief to load up the fire hose and bring it down. The police chief gave a warning before he turned on the fire hose and sprayed any remaining sympathizers with freezing water, which dispersed the crowd. On October 2nd, a jury trial was arranged for the four men. The defendants argued that it was the police that violated the city ordinance. If the police hadn't arrested them, the crowd wouldn't have started hooting and hollering at them. The prosecution argued that if they hadn't been making speeches, the crowd wouldn't have been there in the first place. The judge sides with the prosecutors, and these four were sentenced to 15 days in jail, but only $1 in fines. While the trial was happening, Gurley Flynn organized another rally. Many townspeople protested the use of the fire hose the previous night, since several spectators were injured. The police managed to scatter this protest without the use of freezing water, or having the mob turn into a riot. On October 3rd, reinforcements from Spokane started to arrive. Gurley Flynn arranged the Wobblies into speaking groups that would claim a soapbox in random spaces in the business district. By spreading out, they were dispersing the cops throughout the city and drawing more attention to their cause. The small city jail started to fill up. At this point, the Wobblies landed on a decent strategy for squeezing the city of funds and support. The Wobblies would spend the night in jail, then be released the following day. They arranged to get arrested right before dinner, and then they would stay until breakfast in the jails, forcing the city to pay for 2 meals for each arrest. Missoula was also responsible for arranging trials, paying for additional offices and officers, and transporting prisoners to the county jail. All the prisoners demanded to be tried individually instead of collectively, thereby increasing the cost to the city. Public opinion was also slowly turning against the city due to the cost and the force used by the police. Many Missoulians were unhappy when officers arrested Gurley Flynn as well. In the evening of the 3rd, Gurley Flynn was arrested for disturbing the peace and quiet on the corner of Higgins Avenue and Front Street. She would spend 2 nights in jail before the charges were dismissed. When Flynn was arrested, she said the IWW could not be suppressed, even if 10 men were jailed every day. Her lieutenant, another woman by the name of Edith Frenette, took charge. Gurley Flynn spent her time in jail in the witness room since the city jail was one-room cell under the fire station and was filled with wobbly men. Many of the public condemned the city for arresting a woman, and her $50 bond was paid for by Missoulians. Free speech advocates and IWW members welcomed the arrest since they knew it would strain the resources of the city, and eventually the public tide would turn to their side. The conditions in the jail were not great. The jail was dirt floor below horse stalls, and many wobblies reported being beaten and treated badly. Despite these conditions, many of the wobblies laughed, joked, and sang, keeping their morale high, and they could be heard from the courthouse across the street and anyone else walking through that area of downtown Missoula. The city rented out the basement of the Missoula Hotel to use as an extra courtroom, and they hired additional police officers to help manage the wobbly protests. On October 5th, Gurley Flynn was released. No records of her court proceedings or trial takes place, and she did not talk about it in her autobiography. That evening, while she held a meeting at the Harnoy Theater, Flynn was busy arranging speakers in the downtown area. 20 arrests were made immediately. Flynn then took the stage and tried to speak. She was then arrested as well. A crowd followed her to the jail, and a riot nearly started when someone threw a rock at a police officer. The prisoners sang loudly to welcome Flynn to the jail. On October 6th, Flynn was released from jail. By some accounts, there were over 40 wobblies now in the city jail. Those serving 50-day sentences were moved to the county prison. The wobblies continued to sing and make speeches from the city jail. An acting mayor was appointed and an attempt at negotiation was started on the 7th. On the morning of the 7th, the jails opened before breakfast and police ordered all the occupants out. All but one refused to leave. They demanded a jury trial and breakfast. One man did leave to go see his wife, but he returned that afternoon and demanded to be let back in. The police decided not to let him in. That morning, the Daily Missoulian printed a condemnation of the police action by the Butte Miners Union. The negotiations between the acting mayor and the IWW were going nowhere, and the decision about what to do next would be determined by how the judge ruled in the next set of trials. On the night of the 7th, there were an estimated 70 public speakers in the city jail. On October 8th, the city capitulated. All wobblies were released. Trials would be held the following day, but those trials never took place. The newspapers stopped their coverage of the events in Missoula. A reporter for the Butte Miners stated that there was a city council meeting held on the 8th, and they reached the decision to allow public speakers to speak as long as they didn't impede traffic. That morning, the wobblies gathered at their usual space, but no police were there. Spectators lost interest, and by 9 a.m., the wobblies packed it up and returned to the theater. Some scholars suspected that Missoula capitulated due to upcoming events. The Big Apple show was scheduled to start in just 3 days, and it was rumored that an additional 500 wobblies were making their way to Missoula. The city could not afford to continue housing, feeding, and prosecuting the same individuals for the same offense repeatedly, so they let it go, and life returned to normal. The IWW never gained a foothold in Missoula, and after 1915, they were no longer in any city directory. By all appearances, the wobblies won this fight, and it ended rather anticlimactically. But in terms of labor rights, nothing changed for the lumberjacks or the job sharks because of this battle. After things settled in Montana, Gurley Flynn was called to Spokane for a very similar issue. The free speech battle is the center of the events in the Cold Millions by Jess Walters. The lessons in the IWW learned in Missoula helped the IWW engage in other free speech battles, most notably the one in Spokane. The union learned that city governments could not afford to prosecute and arrest large numbers of protesters every day, for days on end, and it was possible for public opinion to be swayed to support orators. The IWW also learned that they could call upon a large number of transient migrant workers to join them in their fights. The battle in Spokane was longer, larger, and made national headlines. While these tactics worked, Gurley Flynn and other leaders had to be creative to persevere. After the battle in Missoula, Jack Jones stayed, while Gurley Flynn and Frank Little were called back to Spokane when a similar battle began in November of 1909. She was arrested in Spokane for her part in the free speech battle that took place there, but she was later acquitted. Gurley Flynn was an organizer in the 1913 textile strike in Lawrence, Massachusetts, and the 1914 Patterson strike in New Jersey. She primarily mobilized women, black men, and migrants and advocated for their inclusion in labor rights and civil disobedience. Most of these groups were excluded from other unions at the time. She left the IWW in 1916 but didn't stop being an activist. In 1918, Gurley Flynn started the National Civil Liberties Bureau, which was the precursor to the American Civil Liberties Union. She joined the Communist Party in 1936 and was an anti-fascist. In 1939, after the Soviet-Nazi alliance, she was ousted from the ACLU for being a member of the Communist Party. In 1954, she was arrested for violating the Smith Alien Registration Act. She defended herself but was convicted and sentenced to 2 years in prison. She died in 1964 while visiting the Soviet Union. Thanks for coming, and I hope you've discovered a little more about this character and the life she led. If you haven't had a chance to read the book yet, you can get it from the library or any one of our partners for the One Book, One Bozeman program. The library will host additional programs throughout the year tied to the themes of the book, so check back with us for upcoming events.